Audiogenic football games. These were some great football games. My boxes are still full of discs containing things like databases for Emlyn Dukes, tactics for European champions, and lots of different saves for Super League Manager. When I started making this video, I set out to solve kind of a mystery about Super League Manager, but I didn't find at all what I expected. Audiogenic's first football game was Emlyn Dukes International Soccer for the C64 in 1989. Then it was ported to other systems like the Amiga, which is the version I will be using here. In this game you could play leagues and cups, you could play a full season where the players' form would fluctuate and players would get injured and you'd have to pick your team. And this doesn't sound like much in 2020, but in 1989 this was a novel idea. Now every database only had 8 teams, so you'd have to keep a lot of databases if you wanted to play different leagues. Because you could edit everything in this game. Teams, players, even the players' skills. Just having named players was a big thing in 1989. The kit editor was revolutionary. If you were lucky in the early 90s, you could maybe pick the color of the shirt and the shorts in a game. Here you had 6 colors that you could make with a color slider and then put in the 7 fields that made up the kit. You could pick different styles for the shirt and everything. The graphics were nice for the early 90s. The sprites were big and rather detailed. The animation wasn't great, but it was serviceable. Perspective of the field is a little weird. It's very long and not very wide. The thing that set this game apart were the controls. You could use basic controls like in any football game, but you could also use the more advanced controls, which meant you could be running one way and kicking the other, which allowed for such a novel concept as crosses, for instance. The game did okay in reviews, usually getting between 70 and 80, with reviewers often citing the controls as the big plus, while also putting the difficulty of mastering the controls in the minus column. European Champions 1993. Produced by Audiogenic but published by Ocean. This game has some interesting box art. Just look at Marcel Desailly embracing Bernard Tapie, who allegedly orchestrated the fixed match that caused this Marseille team to be stripped of their French league title. They did get to keep the Champions League trophy. And the manual is an absolute old school brick. This game has club teams complete with real player names from the top 5 European leagues. Unfortunately, many of the editing options from Emlyn Dukes are gone here. You can only change the player names, you can't do anything about the team names or the stats of the players, and you can't do anything about the kits. European Champions came with my favorite tactics editor ever. It's basically a standard tactics editor of the times, with the field divided up into different zones, and within these zones you set the players' positions when the ball is in the zone. And you can of course set these positions for attack and defense for when you have the ball and when you don't have the ball. What sets this editor apart is the innovative use of zones. Normally zones would just be squares, but in this editor they're more attuned to the flow of a normal football game. And I love to fiddle around with these things in my teens, and I felt this gave me more options for my wingers and my wingbacks. You can also set 3 targets for distribution. Do you want your left back to look for deep options before he lays the ball off to the midfielder? You can totally do this here. The controls were an evolution over the Emlyn Dukes controls. Ping pass passes to the selected receiver at the tap of a button, while point to pass lets you select a receiver by holding down the button and pointing the joystick towards them. By now we're in the era of post-kickoff to post-sensible soccer, so this game defaults to an overhead view, which always seemed a little too zoomed in to me. Fortunately, you can change to a side view at the press of a button, and you can do this seamlessly during a game. Tactically, the passing-focused control system makes the gameplay very early 90s Britain. There are a lot of long balls and headed flick-ons. Even the El Clasico here plays like Notts Forest v Wolves. This never bothered me though, I love British football. This game reviewed even better than Emlyn Dukes, having scores up into the low 90s. Wembley International Soccer, released in 1994, initially only as an AGA version for the 1200 and the CD32. However, there seems to exist an ECS-OCS version released 2 years later, but I was not aware of this version in the 90s. The editing options in this game are as limited as those in European Champions. We are back to the international teams of Emlyn Hughes, and the players' names are fake. And in the case of Sweden, hilarious. They're editable though. The tactics editor has unfortunately been relegated to a much lower division this time around. The zones are now, well, invisible, and the isometric view makes the player get in the way of each other, they're hard to click and they're hard to see. This is a steep downgrade. The Wembley match play is about the same as European Champions, but with some nice new innovations. The targeted players shows up in a little box, which is a cool feature that can be a little confusing sometimes. My favorite innovation is the fact that when you have a free kick, you control the receiver of the free kick while the kicker is in the little box. Finally, we arrive at my favorite Audiogenic game, Super League Manager, from 1995. AGA version came on 2 discs, which included a version of the Wembley International Soccer match engine in which you could watch or play your matches. The ECS version came on 1 disc and required you to have a copy of Emlyn Hughes International Soccer to be able to watch or play the matches. I only had this budget re-release version, but it worked fine. The box art is again fantastic. And I just love the basicness of this disc, with the Fujifilm branding still on there and the slightly crooked label. This game was in development for a very long time. In Emlyn Hughes there are Super League Manager ad boards in the stadium, and there are early previews as early as 1991 that mentions features such as managing an international team, and also talks about the involvement of Lou Macari and Wimbledon legend Dave Bassett in the development of this game. Though later previews says the deal with Lou Macari was cancelled about halfway through the development, and they make no mention of Dave Bassett. According to those previews, the involvement of Lou Macari still had a lot of impact on how the game depicts the day-to-day running of a football club. Screenshots from those early previews look very much like what the game looked like when it was eventually released in 1995. There are even some very early reviews suggesting Audiogenic even sent out review copies that early in the process. And it was originally supposed to be released in late 1991, but for some reason it got postponed and wasn't released until 1995. And the 8-bit version never appeared at all, which is a pity considering how well the C64 version of Emlyn Hughes was received. The game starts off with you being handed the role of manager at Folkford United, a team in steep decline. All of the teams in this game are fictional, and they all have a background story detailed in the manual. The game takes an RPG-like approach where you go around your office drinking tea and watering your pot plant. Every day you go through the usual routine of reading your mail and answering any fan mail. Always answer yes is a good bet, and then maybe read a scout report or 2 about players you like. But of course there are also your normal tasks for a management game, like picking the team. There are no spreadsheets in this game, all you have are written statements from trainers or scouts or physios, detailing such things as preferred position, a player's current form, their value, and notes on happiness or training. This game puts a huge emphasis on the training schedule. Getting a good schedule down is the be-all end-all of success in this game. The schedule has to be changed every week, or else the player's form will drop dramatically. This sounds like a huge chore for a management game, but fortunately you can find a good schedule and then just alternate between gym circuit and aerobics every Wednesday and you'll be fine. Other than your mailbox, most of your communications will be over the phone, where you will be contacted by the trainer or the physio or even the chairman or managers from other clubs. The phone is also where all the player negotiations take place. The part where the phone is often busy and you'll have to wait for the other manager to phone you back is a little too realistic. Picking your team is down to weighing form, player value and fitness together. If you just have your training schedule set perfectly, then everyone will be on good form, and then player value will be your main source of information for who to pick. Form is hugely important. If your goalie is out of form, put your on-form midfielder in goal instead. Once you're done picking your team, it's off to the game. If you're lucky enough to have your team on match of the day, you can either watch the game or play it yourself. This happens maybe once a season in the lower divisions and can happen many times when you're the top team. Otherwise, you'll have to watch the simulation. I love the goal celebration here, it feels really authentic. It reminds me of the great celebration from Football Masters. Injuries can occur during the game, in which case you have all of 2 substitutes to choose from, so choose them wisely when you set your team up. Once you get rolling, you'll crush all opposition, and you'll shoot up the league system in no time. And your ratings will look like this. The generated match reports in the paper actually read pretty well. They do a good job of not being too repetitive for being auto-generated. If your team were on match of the day though, and you watched the game, then the match report will be blank and just say as seen on match of the day. The interaction between the sim engine and the match engine is one of the game's biggest drawbacks. Technically it works just fine, but it often produces very different results for the same game. The sim engine has its own quirks. You can never score more than 6 goals, and you can never win by more than 5. Watching the games are actually quite fun. The Wembley engine plays some good football and your team will score some cracking goals. Do these sound effects sound familiar to you? Well, that's because all of these games use the exact same pack of sounds. Eventually, you'll sit at the top of the table in Division 1. And once you've won this Division 3 times, you get the call. The FA will contact you and offer you the job as manager of England. Coincidentally, this is exactly the point at which my research went sideways. Now the way I remember this is that the FA called you up and gave you a number to use if you wanted the job as the manager of England. No one knew what to do with this number. It was generally considered useless, like a remnant of a defunct feature or expansion. However, in January of 2016, user Andy on My Abandonware made a post in the review section of Super League Manager. He claims to have actually called the number from the game and gotten in contact with Audiogenic and been given some kind of certificate of having finished the game. So I wanted to solve the mystery of this elusive number. I went looking for screenshots or clips where this number occurs, but I couldn't find any. I tried to put the question to Peter Calver, producer of these games, but I waited for a few weeks without hearing back, and I wanted to get on with the video. So I only saw one solution. It was time, for the first time in 25 years, to actually go through the whole game. Don't get me wrong, I've played this many times over the years, but usually once you get to be the top team in Division 1, your team will be so overpowered that keeping that game going will be pointless. And I figured at the end I would find the number and I could see if it was a real number that would have been possible to call, or was it just a fake number that we're supposed to use like a code in some expansion. But as it turns out, everyone was wrong, because, well, there is no number. In fact, there's not even a phone call. There's just this note you get from the secretary saying the FA contacted her and gave her a number for you to call. But the number is not included in this message. So what's my conclusion? Well, if there's one thing that hanging out in the Swedish skeptics movement for the last 15 years has taught me, it is the fact that memories are a shitty source of information. I put this down to a myth or a misunderstanding that turned into a collective false memory in the community. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. And I'd be the happiest of all if someone proved me wrong with a screenshot or a clip.